Have you ever heard of a girl who was too hard to please, rejecting every suitor only to end up marrying a skullhead? This is the story of Princess Nancy, the most beautiful maiden in a faraway kingdom. Every young man wanted to marry her. Wealthy merchants, noble warriors, and even rich elders came with gifts of gold, silk, and precious gems. But Nancy refused them all. She turned down every proposal with harsh words. Some men were too old for her liking. Others were not tall enough or did not have the perfect face she dreamed of. No man in her land was good enough. She wanted a prince from a faraway kingdom, the most handsome man in the world, strong, perfect, and capable of loving her properly. Her parents, the king and queen, pleaded with her to choose a husband, but she would not listen. They warned her that beauty fades and that a good heart mattered more than outward appearance, but she ignored them. She was determined to marry a prince who looked like the hero from a fairy tale. Then one day, something happened that changed her life forever. News spread through the kingdom like wildfire that a stranger had been seen in the market, more handsome than any man they had ever known. His face shone like the morning sun, his muscles were strong, and his voice was smooth like honey. Women in the marketplace whispered in admiration. The men stood aside, watching him with envy. When Nancy heard this, she rushed to the marketplace. The moment she saw him, her heart skipped a beat. He was everything she had ever wanted in a man. His clothes were elegant, and his posture was regal. Without hesitation, she invited the handsome stranger to the palace. Her parents were suspicious of this sudden appearance. They had never seen him before, nor had they heard of his family. The king, curious about the young man, asked him where he came from. The stranger smiled charmingly and said he was from a distant land beyond the rivers and mountains. His voice was soft and convincing. The prince wasted no time in asking for Nancy's hand in marriage. Though her parents were hesitant, they finally agreed. However, they begged her to stay in their kingdom. The queen pleaded with her daughter to let the prince remain in their land so they could watch over her. But Nancy refused. She insisted that she must go with her husband to his homeland. Ignoring their warnings, she packed her finest dresses and jewels and set off with her prince. She thought she was going to live the perfect fairy tale. She had no idea of the nightmare that awaited her. For days, they traveled through forests, across rivers, and over high mountains. The journey was long, and Nancy began to notice strange things happening. As they walked, a man approached and called out to the prince, demanding that he return his legs. To Nancy's horror, the prince removed his legs and handed them over. He continued walking, now stumbling forward on nothing but his knees. Not long after, another man appeared and asked for his arms. Without hesitation, the prince removed his arms and gave them away. Nancy gasped in shock. She could not believe what she was seeing. Then another man came forward and asked for his face. The prince calmly removed his face and returned it to the owner. By the time they arrived at his homeland, there was nothing left of the handsome prince. He was now just a talking skull. Nancy screamed in terror, unable to understand what had just happened. She demanded to know where her husband had gone and what had happened to his body. The skull laughed and told her the truth. He had borrowed all the body parts from the spirit so he could trick her into marrying him. In reality, he was never human. He was only a skull, but he knew that Nancy would never have agreed to marry him if she had seen him in his true form. Nancy collapsed in terror. She had married a skull. The Skull Prince dragged Nancy to his home, a dark and eerie cave filled with whispering spirits and crawling shadows. Strange figures moved in the darkness, watching her with hollow eyes. The air was heavy with the sound of eerie laughter and distant cries. There, she met his mother, an old, withered spirit who barely moved. The old woman was feeble and incapable of doing much for herself. Nancy, once a spoiled princess, was now forced to live as a servant. She cooked, cleaned, and fetched water while the Skull Prince laughed at her misery. There was no escape for her. Every path out of the cave was blocked by spirits, waiting to drag her back if she tried to run. One evening, as she sat crying, the skull prince mocked her. He reminded her of how she had rejected all the men in her land because they were not perfect enough for her. Now, she belonged to him, and there was nothing she could do about it. Nancy regretted everything. She wished she had listened to her parents. One day, the skull prince's mother called Nancy aside. The old woman had been watching her closely and saw that she was different from the other humans who had been trapped in the spirit land. The old woman told Nancy that because she had been kind to her and had not mistreated her despite her suffering, she would help her escape. However, there was one condition. Nancy had to promise that she would never disobey her parents again. Without hesitation, Nancy swore that she had learned her lesson. The old woman then summoned a clever spider, known as the best hairdresser in the spirit world. The spider worked on Nancy's hair, styling it in a magical way so that the wind spirits would recognize her as a guest of honor. She also gave Nancy beautiful anklets and bracelets filled with protective magic. This would keep her safe on her journey home. Then, the old woman called upon the wind itself. With her supernatural power, she commanded the wind to take Nancy back to her father's kingdom. A strong but gentle breeze lifted Nancy high into the sky, carrying her over forests, rivers, and mountains. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, she was standing outside her father's palace. When the king and queen saw their daughter, they were overjoyed. They had thought she was lost forever. The queen rushed to embrace her, tears streaming down her face. Nancy fell to her knees before her parents and begged for forgiveness. She admitted that she should have listened to them and that she had learned her lesson in the hardest way possible. The king forgave her and told her that what mattered most was that she was home. The entire kingdom celebrated for 8 days and 8 nights. There was feasting, dancing, and music, for the lost princess had returned. From that day on, a new law was made. No princess would be allowed to marry a stranger from a distant land unless his family was known and trusted. Later, a kind and noble prince from a neighboring village came to ask for Nancy's hand. This time, she did not hesitate. She had learned the true value of kindness, wisdom, and love. Nancy and the prince were married in a grand ceremony, and they lived happily ever after. This time, there were no skulls in sight. Moral of the story: listen to your parents, for they have wisdom beyond your understanding, and never judge a person by their appearance alone.